Republican rebels are bucking the party's pro-business orthodoxy and, in some cases, joining Democrats to push populist pro-union policies. The latest example came last week when a handful of House Republicans worked with Democrats to kill a series of GOP labor bills favored by Republican leadership. Here to break down what this says about the Republican Party is Emily Brooks. She is the Hill's House leadership reporter and author of The Movement, a newsletter about the influences and debates shaping politics on the right. Hey, Emily, so tell us about this package of proposals put forward by Republican leadership and then this pushback we got from a small group of Republicans.
Yeah, so this package of proposals, there wasn't really any indication that these were going to make it to President Trump's desk. Like they were going to pass through the House and then probably go to the Senate where they would have needed 60 votes in support with Democrats, which wasn't going to happen. So they were, in a sense, sort of messaging bills. They would do things like change the definition of hours worked when it comes to pay that's required for voluntary trainings for which would alter some labor agreements on which people were paid for training. There's a bill to change the definition of like which companies were considered joint employers that was aimed at changing some rules for franchisees and franchise owners. But this slate of proposals, and somewhat surprisingly, failed on the House floor when 6 Republicans voted against that initial bill to change hours worked rules. And there were a lot of more moderate Republicans, Northeastern Republicans in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, who voted against this, but also a little bit of a more industrial policy populist kind of member from a very red Republican district, Representative Riley Moore of West Virginia, who voted against this. And that is sort of reflective of this shift that's happening in the Republican Party, where not only do moderate Republicans who have large union contingencies in their constituencies and their district have an interest in maybe pushing back on this, but so do some of these more populist members who are turning towards these policies that are pro-unions and pro-labor.
Did these members that voted against these proposals tell you why they did it?
Yes, Riley Moore, I talked to him right after the vote. He noted his experience as a welder early in his career and was concerned that there would be undue pressure on workers to go to these voluntary trainings and not get paid for them, even though they are considered voluntary. And that's like the kind of concern that you really hear a lot from, more of the Democratic side of things and a lot of the very pro-union arguments. So it was unusual to hear that kind of argument coming from a Republican, particularly when the rest of the Republican Party was pretty much unified in voting for it. And then you had another member, Jeff Van Drew of New Jersey, who voted against this. He said, well, I'm a conservative, but I'm also a populist. And he was worried about what these bills would mean for the affordability message that Republicans are trying to push ahead of the midterm election, saying that if these pass, this would contribute to maybe some lower pay for certain workers than if they were not passed. And so he didn't see a benefit in voting for that and was sort of warning Republicans against pursuing these kind of policies. So those are, the tension that Republicans are feeling. Republicans and President Trump have tried to appeal to union workers. The Teamsters president spoke at the Republican National Committee last year, even though he didn't officially endorse President Trump. That was pretty notable shift in how Republicans were relating to union members. But it certainly, it was only 6 Republicans who voted against this. It's enough to kind of tank the slate of labor bills since it is a very slim majority. But I think it also shows that shift in how Republicans are approaching labor and unions is not really overwhelming in the party just yet.
What do traditional Republicans think about this pro-labor push from some in their party? I mean, Republicans used to talk about protecting the job creators, the importance of small businesses. Is there any discomfort in the party leaning into the policies of organized labor that have traditionally been supported by Democrats?
Yeah, certainly there's discomfort about that. I mean, the reason why these were all coming to the House floor was that the Republican leaders and the Republicans in the Education and Workforce Committee that advanced these proposals were pretty confident at Republican unity about this. This wasn't something that there were a lot of concerns about getting Republican support for. This is something that was, were designed to support. The argument was that particularly the bill that would deal with franchise owners and companies that franchise their companies would help these small business owners. And so that was the argument there. And the whole idea is to not be a burden on those small business owners. But Jeff Andrews said there's other ways to help small business owners than the proposals in this bill and in some of these other bills. And so there is that growing tension about what exactly does it mean to be a Republican pushing an affordability message, pushing a populist message in 2026 and ahead of the midterms. And are these kind of policies that are designed to support small businesses going to be detrimental to the kind of constituencies that Republicans are hoping to court ahead of the midterm elections?
You mentioned that you still had a majority of Republicans voting in favor of this slate of bills. It was mostly Democrats that blocked them. Is this just a few vulnerable Republicans kind of covering their butts for the midterm elections and not maybe as much of a break from Republican pro business policies?
That's something that I'm looking out for. Certainly, a lot of the Republicans who did vote with all Democrats to take that down was, a very small percentage of the Republican Party that voted to tank this, right? So it is these Republicans in these swing districts. But also, I look at Riley Moore, who's in a very, very safe Roby red Republican district in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, who also voted against this and is pushing this idea of reinvigorating industrialization in the US as a means of national security. And then over in the Senate, you have Josh Hawley in Missouri, who's not, a member who's at risk of losing to a Democrat in that state right now, who's also pushing on these labor issues. He held up one of Trump's nominees to the NRLB over concerns that this was a Boeing executive because there was a big union fight and a strike that was affecting Missouri. And he has been also a very, populist economics, pro labor Republican. So, when Trump has been courting these kind of workers and union members, particularly in the Rust Belt states that flipped from being a reliable Democrat to switching to support President Trump in the last couple of election cycles. What does that really mean for Republican policies? Are they taking that as a cue to change their policies, or is it mostly, just the appeal of Trump as a person? What does that populist message actually mean when it comes to the nitty gritty of these labor policies? That's something that Republicans are still trying to figure out.
Yeah, I wonder if you think that even if the GOP has a ways to go before it can be considered an ally of organized labor, maybe votes like this can give the impression that Republicans are not antagonistic to labor issues and allow them to continue improving their performance among rank and file union members.
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, certainly, I would not say that Republicans are an ally of unions right now. They are still pretty hostile to unions in a lot of senses, and the major unions opposed a lot of these bills that they were trying to advance last week. But you do have Republicans who, when they do agree with unions or something, they're pointing to that and amplifying that, particularly when there was one government union that was calling for an end to the government shutdown a couple of months ago. Republicans were saying, look, the unions are on our side. When the Teamsters president spoke at the RNC, that was something that a lot of Republicans were very excited about. When, there were a lot of Republicans who, have been talking about reindustrialization, supporting Trump's tariff regime with the idea of building up that populist industrial base and bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. There were hearing shifts in rhetoric on that, and it's part of the shifts in the Republican Party away from total free market values and principles, and changing that perspective to be a little bit more populist and focused on benefits for individual workers over corporations. So, is that going to last? We'll see. That's why I'm tracking all of this in the movement.
Yeah, I wonder what are you going to be watching for over the next month or maybe even leading up to the midterm elections that will give you an indication about whether the pro-union populist faction of the Republican Party is kind of moving or that kind of that momentum stalls out.
Certainly, any endorsements, bills that if this holds up any other bills, I think that's going to be very big. If it probably would be pretty rare that any unions would get involved in any of the pro on the Republican side for midterm races. But if there's maybe a primary where that would weigh in, that would be pretty notable there. And then also, if there's any other rebellions for Republicans going against the actions of the Trump administration, another incident of Republicans joining with Democrats in favor of organized labor was when a handful of Republicans forced a vote with all Democrats on a bill to undo the Trump administration's crackdown on federal unions and several agencies. So that was notable as well. And if there's any more instances like that, certainly going to be looking at that.
All right, Emily Brooks, always fascinating to hear from you. And you too can have Emily's insights right in your inbox. Head over to thehill.com, click on newsletters, and have the movement delivered right to your email inbox. Emily Brooks, thanks again.
Thank you.